Today, we are going to continue with our behavioral ecology and talk about how many of the world's organisms live in colonies or live in social groups, like what you're seeing here with the prairie dog. And so, we first of all want to investigate what are the advantages or why are there so many types of organisms that live in a social type of environment. And if we remember, biology has two main goals. It's to reproduce, create offspring, and it's to stay alive. And so living in social groups allows them to stay alive better. Why? Because you have more predator detection, so more eyes on the lookout, and you can also work together in order to deter some of those predators from maybe causing your group harm. And so we see this with different types of like buffalo or herding creatures. Well, sometimes they will gang up and drive out some type of predator that might be trying to eat maybe one of their young or one of their vulnerable. However, sometimes in these social groups, you will also see a hierarchy. You've probably heard of like an alpha male before or a beta, and we see this a lot with like wolves, where there's usually a dominance hierarchy that is created. And so sometimes this will lead to males being kicked out if they are challenging the top male, or sometimes it can lead to a lot of like brutal fights or even death if there's a lot of competition that's taking place. And so we see this, that there certainly are some pros to a lot of pros to social living, but also some negatives as well. Sometimes there will also be selfish herds. So that's a group maybe within the population that stays together, and other members of the group might be self-sacrificial and compete for those safe spots. And so again, our most popular example of this, and what a lot of people know, are wolves, and how there's usually the dominant male, usually a dominant female. Sometimes the young, if the young will go off instead of trying to compete for the other spots. So there are also some costs of social living. If you're living in large groups, that can also lead to a lot of competition for food, for resources, for mates. And also, because you're in such close proximity to each other, you're more vulnerable to disease and parasitism. And so, especially in herding creatures, that can be a negative. And then, of course, exploitation by other group members, or in other words, essentially getting kicked out or not allowed anymore. And so there are costs to that social living, and sometimes you're basically left out or you can't compete, and so then maybe you go to create your own, or maybe you go try to find another one, and sometimes those aren't necessarily well received either. Not only do we see this with like our larger creatures, and again, even bacteria, they live in colonies. Algae lives in colonies. So a lot of creatures live in this social setting. We really see this very, very well in our insects, specifically with like bees and ants, where you have like colonies of worker insects that are sterile, so they're not able to, create offspring. And then you have like the queen bee, so they actually have like their spots designated before they're even born and what they become. We also can see the same thing with termites, where they have a single queen and they have some kings that are taking over the entire colony. So it's kind of weird that we see some different governments that control people, and we also see this also with actual biology, with real life. And so bees are very much an example of this also, where you have those worker bees, which are typically females. You have the single queen, which is the mother. And then you also, at certain times, might have males that are going to reproduce or help out. So very unique when we look at some of those types of situations where you have the colonial interactions. Not only that, but we also have, for example, troops of chimpanzees. Um, the movie that Disney put out, literally called Chimpanzee, is excellent and really talks about how the roles that play within chimpanzees and how that bond is so important to make sure that troop sticks together. They are certainly a type of social creature. And we know that with the care of young with the parental care. Sometimes that will fall on the female, sometimes the male, and then sometimes it will be both. And so it's very unique to look at some of these different social interactions. So, in our discovery of behaviors, we know that there's a lot of different kinds, but one of the most popular is this type of social living because it does provide much more benefits than it does negatives.